This is Audible.
Blackstone Audio presents Applied Economics, Thinking Beyond Stage 1, 2nd edition, by Thomas Sowell. Chapter 1. Politics versus Economics. I don't give a good goddamn what Milton Friedman says. He's not running for re-election. President Richard Nixon to a White House aide. While economic principles are important, economic actions take place within a framework of laws and government policies that are shaped by political principles, which may or may not be consistent with economic principles. The interaction of political and economic incentives makes the study of economic policy issues more challenging and more revealing than a study of either economic or political principles in isolation. Political versus economic decisions. People tend to respond to the incentives and constraints confronting them, whether they are in the marketplace or in politics. However, those incentives and constraints are very different in these different situations, so it can hardly be surprising that voters tend to behave differently than consumers, and politicians tend to behave differently than sellers of goods and services. Voters. Economic decisions and political decisions are made in different ways, even when the same person makes both kinds of decisions, for example, as a consumer and as a voter. Virtually no one puts as much time and close attention into deciding whether to vote for one candidate rather than another as is usually put into deciding whether to buy one house rather than another, or perhaps even one car rather than another. The voters' political decisions involve having a minute influence on policies which affect many other people, while economic decision-making is about having a major effect on one's own personal well-being. It should not be surprising that the quantity and quality of thinking going into these very different kinds of decisions vary correspondingly. It has been said of many laws and policies that the devil is in the details. But if most voters are not likely to look into those details, many devilish results can be expected from legislation and policies that look good at first glance when packaged with inspiring rhetoric. Politics and the market are both ways of getting some people to respond to other people's desires. But people whose professional careers are in politics operate under different incentives and constraints from those whose careers are in the economy. Consumers choosing which goods to spend their money on have often been analogized to voters deciding which candidates to elect to public office. However, the two processes are profoundly different. Not only do individuals invest very different amounts of time and thought in making economic decisions versus political decisions, those decisions are inherently different in themselves. Voters decide whether to vote for one candidate or another, but they decide how much of what kinds of food, clothing, shelter, etc. to purchase. In short, political decisions tend to be categorical, while economic decisions tend to be incremental. Voting is a package deal. You may agree with candidate A on economic policy, candidate B on foreign policy, and candidate C on environmental issues, but in the end, when you enter the voting booth, you have to vote for one candidate's whole package of policies on the economy, foreign policy, and the environment. Moreover, you don't get to change your mind until the next election. It is not like buying one brand of bread today and a different brand tomorrow if you change your mind. Incremental decisions can be more fine-tuned than deciding which candidate's whole package of principles and practices comes closest to meeting your own desires. Incremental decision-making also means that not every increment of even very desirable things is necessarily desirable, given that there are other things that the money could be spent on after having acquired a given amount of a particular good or service. For example, although it might be worthwhile spending considerable money to live in a nice home, buying a second home in the country may or may not be worth spending money that could be used instead to send a child to college, or to buy an annuity for later retirement years. One consequence of incremental decision-making is that additional increments of many desirable things remain unpurchased because they are almost, but not quite, worth the sacrifices required to get them. From a political standpoint, this means that there are always numerous desirable things that government officials can offer to provide to voters who want them, either free of charge or at reduced government-subsidized prices, even when these voters do not want these increments enough to sacrifice their own money to pay for them. Ultimately, of course, the public can end up paying as taxpayers for increments that they would not have chosen to pay for as consumers. The real winners in this process are the politicians, whose apparent generosity and compassion gain them political support. Politics has sometimes been called the art of the possible, but that implies a level of constraint that simply does not exist in democratic politics. As a noted economist has pointed out, no voting system could prevent the California electorate from simultaneously demanding low electricity prices and no new generating plants while using ever-increasing amounts of electricity. This is just one of many ways in which the impossible can win elections. Beliefs can trump facts in politics and have repeatedly trumped facts throughout history. Demagoguery beats data, as former Congressman Dick Armey put it. But the production and distribution of false beliefs is not solely a result of the skills of demagogues. There are certain kinds of beliefs that tend to be accepted without much evidence, or even in defiance of evidence. No political message has proven to be more welcome in countries around the world, in both democratic and undemocratic nations, and among peoples of every race and culture, than the message that your problems are not your fault, but the fault of others, and it is they who must change, not you. Moreover, it is they who must pay the consequences if they do not change, but not you. Not only particular political candidates, but in some countries, whole revolutionary movements have risen to power on the wings of that message. Politicians. While politicians can be expected to pay far more attention to political decisions than the average voter will, the nature of that attention is also likely to be different. Elected officials' top priority is usually getting re-elected, and their time horizon seldom extends beyond the next election. Laws and policies that will produce politically beneficial effects before the next election are usually preferred to policies that will produce even better results sometime after the next election. Indeed, policies that will produce good results before the next election may be preferred even if they can be expected to produce bad results afterwards. Thinking beyond the immediate consequences of a law or policy is a task which neither voters nor politicians have much incentive to undertake. When most voters do not think beyond stage one, many elected officials have no incentive to weigh what the consequences will be in later stages, and considerable incentives to avoid getting beyond what their constituents think and understand, for fear that rival politicians can drive a wedge between them and their constituents by catering to short-run public perceptions. The very way that issues are conceived tends to be different in politics from the way they are conceived in economics. Political thinking tends to conceive of policies, institutions, or programs in terms of their hoped-for results. Drug prevention programs, gun control laws, environmental protection policies, public interest law firms, profit-making businesses, and so forth. But for purposes of economic analysis, what matters is not what goals are being sought, but what incentives and constraints are being created in pursuit of those goals. We know, for example, that many, if not most, profit-making enterprises do not, in fact, make profits, as shown by the high percentage of new businesses that fail and go out of business within a few years after getting started. Similarly, it is an open question whether drug prevention programs actually prevent or even reduce drug usage, whether public interest law firms actually benefit the public, or whether gun control laws actually control guns. No economist is likely to be surprised when rent control laws, for example, fail to control rent, so that cities with such laws often end up with higher rents than cities without them. New York and San Francisco being classic examples. Footnote 1. See my Basic Economics, 3rd edition, pages 40 to 48. End of footnote. But such outcomes may be very surprising to people who think in terms of political rhetoric focused on desirable goals and who do not think beyond stage 1. The point here is not simply that various policies may fail to achieve their purposes. The more fundamental point is that we need to know the actual characteristics of the processes set in motion, and the incentives and constraints inherent in such characteristics, rather than judging these processes by their goals. Many of the much-discussed unintended consequences of policies and programs would have been foreseeable from the outset if these processes had been analyzed in terms of the incentives and constraints they created instead of in terms of the desirability of the goals they proclaimed. Once we start thinking in terms of the chain of events set in motion by particular policies, and following the chain of events beyond stage 1, the world begins to look very different. In trying to understand the effect of politics on economics, we need to consider not only officials' responses to the various pressures they receive from different sources, but also the way that the media and the voting public see economic issues. Both the media and the voters are prone to what might be called one-stage thinking. One-stage thinking. When I was an undergraduate studying economics under Professor Arthur Smithies of Harvard, he asked me in class one day what policy I favored on a particular issue of the Times. Since I had strong feelings on that issue, I proceeded to answer him with enthusiasm, explaining what beneficial consequences I expected from the policy I advocated. "And then what will happen?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. However, as I thought about it, it became clear that the situation I described would lead to other economic consequences, which I then began to consider and to spell out. "And what will happen after that?" Professor Smithies asked. As I analyzed how the further economic reactions to the policy would unfold, I began to realize that these reactions would lead to consequences much less desirable than those at the first stage, and I began to waver somewhat. "And then what will happen?" Smithies persisted. By now I was beginning to see that the economic reverberations of the policy I advocated were likely to be pretty disastrous, and in fact much worse than the initial situation that it was designed to improve. Simple as this little exercise might seem, it went further than most economic discussions about policies on a wide range of issues. Most thinking stops at stage 1. In recent years, former economic advisers to presidents of the United States, from both political parties, have commented publicly on how little thinking ahead about economic consequences went into decisions made at the highest level. Footnote 2. Herbert Stein and Joseph Stiglitz. End of footnote. This is not to say that there was no thinking ahead about political consequences. Each of the presidents they served, Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton, respectively, was so successful politically that he was re-elected by a wider margin than the vote that first put him in office. Short-run thinking is not confined to politicians, but is often also found among the population at large. Nor is this peculiar to the United States or even to Western societies. When the government of Zimbabwe decreed drastic cutbacks in prices to deal with runaway inflation in June 2007, the citizens of Zimbabwe greeted the price cuts with a euphoric and short-lived shopping spree, according to the New York Times. But just 1 month later, the Times reported, Zimbabwe's economy is at a halt. This was spelled out. Bread, sugar, and cornmeal, staples of every Zimbabwean's diet, have vanished. Meat is virtually non-existent, even for members of the middle class who have money to buy it on the black market. Hospital patients are dying for lack of basic medical supplies. That suppliers do not usually supply as much at a lower price as they do at a higher price is not a complicated economic principle, but it does require stopping to think, and especially to think beyond stage one. Price controls are essentially lies about supply and demand. In the case of Zimbabwe, the artificially low prices created the impression of an affordable abundance that was simply not there. As with other lies, political or otherwise, time may be required for the truth to come out, and it may be too late when it does. Do something policies. In a market economy, millions of people in their various roles as consumers, employees, employers, investors, farmers, etc., are constantly adjusting to changing circumstances, whether these changes are due to technology or to mistaken decisions that set off changes in prices, wages, or rates of return on stocks and bonds. Sometimes these changes are benign, such as the dramatically declining prices of computers during an era when the capabilities of these computers have been increasing equally dramatically. Other changes are negative, as when financial markets adjusted to widespread defaults on risky mortgage loans in 2007 by forcing many borrowers and lenders of these loans into bankruptcy, and produced a tightening up on credit requirements for people who were trying to get new loans. While a self-equilibrating system, like a market economy, confers benefits, its adjustments through changing prices, sales, employment, etc., can present difficulties for particular individuals and enterprises during the process of adjustment, and these difficulties present opportunities for political authorities to intervene, especially in response to demands that they do something to solve economic problems. Whether that undefined something will in fact make matters better or worse economically, in political terms, the demand for action may be irresistible. Thus, in response to inflation in the United States, President Richard Nixon imposed the first peacetime wage and price controls in the history of the country in 1971, despite the advice of economists and despite Nixon's own knowledge of the adverse consequences of wage and price controls. Herbert Stein, chairman of Nixon's Council of Economic Advisers, in later years described some of these adverse consequences. Cattle were being withheld from market, chickens were being drowned, and the food store shelves were being emptied. Such consequences became manifest sometime after the elections, however. The immediate political consequences, however, were overwhelmingly favorable, leading to widespread praise of the president in the media for taking action to deal with inflation, and ultimately to a landslide victory in Nixon's bid for re-election in 1972. In retrospect, the economic consequences of Nixon's wage and price controls have been widely recognized as negative, but voters vote on the basis of how things look to them at the time, not how the consequences will be assessed later in retrospect. In short, do-something policies are often a result of not thinking beyond stage one, and of politicians who respond to voter short-sightedness, even if the politicians themselves know better. As Herbert Stein noted, the wage and price controls did not visibly affect the course of the inflation and were not expected by the White House to do so. In his memoirs, Nixon said that his imposing wage and price controls was politically necessary and immensely popular in the short run, but in the long run, I believe that it was wrong. The piper must always be paid, and there was an unquestionably high price for tampering with the orthodox economic mechanisms. Looking back on the same events, Milton Friedman said, "The disastrous economic effects came after Nixon's landslide re-election in 1972, which the controls helped to bring about." Like other price controls in countries around the world, and over thousands of years of history, Nixon's price controls led to a reduction in the amount of goods supplied, while the lower prices led to an increase in the amount of goods demanded, producing shortages. These shortages were seldom blamed on Nixon at the time, and the gasoline shortages that led to long lines at filling stations were blamed on oil companies by many in politics and in the media. So politically successful was the demonizing of oil companies that neither of Nixon's next two successors, Presidents Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, dared to cancel price controls on oil, even after the other Nixon price controls had been lifted. As economist Herbert Stein, still on the White House staff during the Ford administration, said, "The main problem was probably political. Fear of being accused of sacrificing homeowners and commuters for the profit of the oil companies." Later, President Carter began to loosen the oil price controls, but as late as 1979, there were recurrent gasoline shortages and long lines at filling stations where motorists sometimes sat in their cars for an hour or more before reaching the pump, which in some cases ran out of gas by the time they got there. But by this time, virtually no one traced the gasoline shortages back to the Nixon price controls years earlier, or to the demonization of oil companies, which kept oil price controls on years after other price controls had been rescinded. It was 1981, a decade after the Nixon price controls began, that the Reagan administration abolished the last of the price controls on oil amid dire predictions from critics that gasoline prices would skyrocket. Instead, gasoline lines disappeared, and as supplies of oil increased, gasoline prices began declining, eventually reaching lower levels than under price controls. Sometimes the temptation to do something reflects more than just a cynical calculation of political advantages. Often there is a belief that government intervention is necessary, even if the specific form of that intervention may have to be determined in a trial-and-error process. President Franklin D. Roosevelt articulated this approach during the Great Depression of the 1930s. "The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." FDR did not mistake the temper of the country. He was the most successful politician in American history, being elected president an unprecedented 4 times. During his career and for decades thereafter, many saw his policies as responsible for getting the country out of the Great Depression. However, with the passing years and additional research and analysis, more and more economists and historians have seen his policies as needlessly prolonging the Depression by generating a pervasive uncertainty as to what the government was going to do next, leaving both consumers and investors hesitating to part with their money. This in turn meant an inadequate demand for goods and for the labor to produce those goods. FDR seems never to have considered that incessant experimentation in and of itself was a process which could have high costs for the economy, irrespective of the merits or demerits of particular experiments. Government experimentation is different from private experimentation, which, for better or worse, affects only those who engage in it and who have every incentive to stop when it becomes clear that the experiment is not working. But government experiments with the rules under which millions of other people must operate, and the prospect that the basic rules of the economy are likely to continue changing without notice at any time, is not a prospect that encourages long-term investment by businesses or even short-term spending by consumers. People tend to hang on to their money when they don't know what is likely to happen next. Prior to the Great Depression of the 1930s, there was no tradition of federal government intervention to get the United States out of depressions. Roosevelt's predecessor, President Herbert Hoover, was the first president to take on that responsibility, and many of his interventions were later simply carried much further by FDR, despite a political myth that persisted for years that Hoover was a do-nothing president. In much later years, even prominent former advisers of the Roosevelt administration admitted that FDR's New Deal was a further extension of what Hoover had been doing. Herbert Hoover was, in fact, the first president to decide to do something on a national scale to try to extricate the country from a depression, though there is no evidence that what he did made things any better, and there is considerable reason to believe that they made things worse. Earlier, in the 1920s, a sharp decline in the economy had been largely ignored by President Calvin Coolidge, and the economy pulled out of its decline in a relatively short time, as it had pulled out of other such declines in the past. There was nothing inevitable about a stock market crash leading to a decade-long depression. Moreover, as Professor Temin of MIT has noted, the 1929 stock market crash was not unique. The stock market has gone up and down many times since then without producing a similar movement in income. The most obvious parallel was in the fall of 1987. The isomorphism was uncanny. The stock market fell almost exactly the same amount on almost exactly the same dates. Another study referred to the October 19, 1987 decline as by far the worst percentage decline day in the stock market's history. In 1987, however, President Ronald Reagan did not react as Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt had in the wake of the 1929 stock market crash. Instead, like Coolidge before him, whom he admired, Reagan let the economy recover on its own. Far from leading to a Great Depression, the recovery began one of the longest periods of sustained high employment, low inflation, and general prosperity in American history. Footnote 3. For the past 20 years or more, its economy has managed an enviable combination of steady growth and low inflation. The Turning Point, The Economist, September 22, 2007, page 35. End of footnote. At the time, however, President Reagan was sharply criticized in the Washington Post for a do-nothing, let-the-problems-accumulate Calvin Coolidge act of the 1980s, and was denounced in the New York Times for having squandered the opportunity to take action. In short, there are many pressures on presidents to do something. Some, like Nixon, succumb to those pressures, and others, like Reagan, just take the heat. It should be noted that Reagan was not eligible for re-election in 1987. Moreover, it is not just free market economists who regard government intervention in depressions as potentially harmful. Long before the Great Depression of the 1930s, it was none other than Karl Marx who referred to crack-brained meddling by the authorities that can aggravate an existing crisis. There was not much in common between Ronald Reagan and Karl Marx, but one of the things that both of them had done was to study economics. Presidents are not the only elected officials under pressure to do something, nor are all the actions taken under such pressures due to cynical disregard of known economic consequences for political reasons, as with President Nixon. Inadequate knowledge of economics also plays a role, as well as an unwillingness to listen to economic advice. Well-known financier, philanthropist, and government official William E. Simon commented on his sense of futility in testifying before Congress on numerous occasions. Most of these hearings were an abysmal waste of time. Nonetheless, I patiently complied with the congressional invitations. I never neglected an opportunity to offer these gentlemen carefully documented evidence of their own historic irresponsibility. In response to various economic problems in 2007, Professor N. Gregory Mankiw of Harvard, a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers, wrote, "The question on the minds of many in Congress and in the White House is this: what they should be doing now to keep the economy on track. The right answer? Absolutely nothing. The feeling that the government should do something has seldom been based on a comparison of what actually happens when government does and when it does not do something. Doing something almost always seems like such a good idea to those who do not look beyond stage one that they see no need to look back at history or to apply economics. The alternative to a do-something approach is not to have the government always do absolutely nothing, but rather to recognize that governments can only do something specific, and that these specifics must be assessed in terms of their specific effects, both immediate and long-term, as well as the general effects of extended experimentation. Although Professor Mankiw urged politicians in Congress and the White House to do nothing, he also argued that the Federal Reserve System, with its professional economists, could do enough to prevent the economy from developing serious problems. Many do-something policies do in fact benefit particular industries, groups, regions, or other segments of the national economy, but that is very different from saying that these policies produce a net benefit to the economy as a whole. For example, during the administration of President George W. Bush, policies to protect the American steel industry from the problems created by having to compete with lower-priced imported steel did in fact save the jobs of many American steel workers and enhance the profits of American steel companies. But the net result was a rise in steel prices within the United States, leading to rising prices of American products made of steel, making those products less competitive at home and in the world market. As a result, far more jobs were lost in American steel-using industries than were saved in the steel-producing industry, and the profit reduction in American steel-using industries was far greater than the profit increase in the steel-producing industry. The intervention seemed successful only to those who did not look beyond the immediate beneficiaries in stage one. Sometimes it is not just that some people benefit at the expense of other people, when future repercussions are not taken into account. Sometimes the very same people who are intended to be helped turn out to be harmed. For example, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1992, the obvious goal was to benefit people who were physically or mentally impaired. Businesses and other institutions were mandated to make reasonable accommodation to those with disabilities, such as making businesses accessible to wheelchairs or taking other steps to enable employees with various disabilities to do their jobs more easily. But a study by 2 economists found that the employment of people with disabilities declined in the wake of this legislation. Employers simply responded to these extra costs imposed by the government by no longer being as willing to hire disabled workers in the first place. The long run. Thinking beyond stage one is especially important when considering policies whose consequences unfold over a period of years. If the initial consequences are good and the bad consequences come later, especially if later is after the next election, then it is always tempting for politicians to adopt such policies. For example, if a given city or state contains a number of prosperous corporations, nothing is easier than to raise money to finance local government projects that will win votes for their political sponsors by raising the tax rates on these corporations. What are the corporations going to do? Pick up their factories, hotels, railroads, or office buildings and move somewhere else? Certainly not immediately in stage one. Even if they could sell their local properties and go buy replacements somewhere else, this would take time, and not all their experienced employees would be willing to move suddenly with them to another city or state. Nevertheless, even under such restrictions on movement, the high taxes would begin to have some immediate effect. When businesses with branches in different locations face declining demand and have to choose which branches to close, those in high-tax cities and states are especially likely to be chosen as the ones to shut down. There is also likely to be an increase in the rate at which businesses go out of business completely in high-tax cities and states, as some struggling firms that might have been able to hold on longer and perhaps ride out their problems are unable to do so when heavy tax burdens are added to their other difficulties and become like the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. Meanwhile, newly arising companies have options when deciding where to locate their factories or offices, and cities and states with high tax rates are likely to be avoided. Therefore, even if all existing and thriving corporations are unable to budge in the short run, the high-tax jurisdictions can begin the process of losing businesses even in Stage 1, but the losses may not be on a scale that is large enough to be noticeable before the next election. Then comes Stage 2. Usually, the headquarters where a business top brass work can be moved before the operating units that have larger numbers of employees and much equipment. Moreover, if the corporation has other operating units in other cities and states, or perhaps overseas, it can begin shifting some of its production to other locations where taxes are not so high, even if it does not immediately abandon its factories or offices in the high-tax communities. This reduction in the amount of business done locally in the high-tax location will in turn begin to reduce the locally earned income on which taxes are paid by both the corporation and its local employees. Stage 3. As corporations grow over time, they can choose to locate their new operations where taxes are not so high, gradually transferring employees who are willing to move and replacing those who are not by hiring new people. Stage 4. As more and more corporations desert the high-tax city or state, eventually the point can be reached where the total tax revenues collected from the remaining corporations under higher tax rates are less than what was collected under the lower tax rates of the past, when there were more businesses paying those taxes. By this time, however, years may have passed, and the politicians responsible for setting this process in motion may well have moved on to higher office in state or national government. More important, even those politicians who remain in office in the local area are unlikely to be blamed for declining tax revenues, lost employment, or cutbacks in government services and neglected infrastructure made necessary by an inadequate tax base. In short, those responsible for such economic declines will probably escape political consequences, unless either the voters or the media think beyond Stage 1 and follow the sequence of events over a period of years, which seldom happens. Footnote 4. There is another sense in which multiple stages must be taken into account, which may be easier to explain by analogy. Imagine that a dam can be emptied into a valley, and that calculations show that this would fill the valley with water to a depth of 20 feet. If your home is located on an elevation 30 feet above the valley floor, it should be safe if the water is slowly released, but if the floodgates are simply flung wide open, a wave of water 40 feet high may roar across the valley, smashing your home and drowning everyone in it. After the water subsides, it will still end up just 20 feet deep, but that will not matter as far as the destruction of the home and people are concerned, even though both are now 10 feet above the level at which the water settles down. A Nobel Prize-winning economist has argued that economic policies suddenly imposed on various third-world countries by the International Monetary Fund have ignored the timing and sequence of reactions inside those countries, which may include irreparable damage to the social fabric as economic desperation creates mass riots that can topple governments and make foreign investors unwilling to put money into such an unstable country for years to come. End of footnote. New York City has been a classic example of this process. Once the headquarters of many of the biggest corporations in America, New York in the early 21st century was headquarters to just one of the 100 fastest-growing companies in the country. With the highest tax rate of any American city, New York has been losing businesses and hundreds of thousands of jobs. Meanwhile, the city has been spending twice as much per capita as Los Angeles and 3 times as much per capita as Chicago on a wide variety of municipal programs. By and large, spend and tax policies have been successful politically, however negative their economic consequences. Killing the goose that lays the golden egg is a viable political strategy so long as the goose does not die before the next election, and no one traces the politician's fingerprints on the weapon. In a complex economy, there are always alternative explanations of local or regional decline that can be blamed in order to deflect attention from policies that have led to economic decline. One popular alternative is to blame jobs going overseas, but whatever the reasons for the decline in existing jobs, which include technological changes and changes in consumer preferences in addition to jobs going overseas, existing jobs are always declining by the millions nationwide, even in a period of full employment. More than 17 million American workers lost their jobs between 1990 and 1995, and yet the unemployment rate was very low because new jobs were being created. However, the Rust Belt regions of the United States have lost jobs for reasons very much like the reasons that New York City has lost jobs. Even when very similar jobs are created in the American economy, Toyota hiring thousands of American workers to build automobiles while General Motors is laying off thousands, these jobs are usually not created in the places where a political or labor union environment is detrimental to business. It is not simply the lost jobs, but the obstacles to the creation of replacement jobs that is at the heart of the problems of the Rust Belt. Political incentives. When you have agents or surrogates looking out for your interests in any aspect of life, political or otherwise, there is always the danger that these agents will look out for their own interests, which do not always coincide with yours. Corporate managements do not always put the stockholders' interest first, and agents for actors, athletes, or writers may sacrifice their clients' interests to their own. There is no reason to expect elected officials to be fundamentally different, but there are reasons to know what their particular incentives are, and what the economic realities are that they may overlook while pursuing their own political goals. A bridge collapse in Minneapolis in 2007, with a number of fatalities among motorists who happened to be on the bridge at the time, led not only to nationwide shock over that particular disaster, but also to widespread attention to the fact that many other bridges around the country were also at risk. Nor were bridges the only infrastructure whose maintenance and repair have tended to be neglected by elected officials. It has been common for roads and highways to develop potholes that are not repaired, even in places where money was being spent for building community centers, golf courses, and other amenities. Yet such choices were perfectly rational from the standpoint of the self-interest of elected officials, given the political incentives and constraints in Stage 1. Repairing bridges, roadways, dams, or government buildings requires money that could be spent doing things with an immediate payoff in favorable publicity for politicians. Building a new recreational facility, plaza, or other impressive structure creates opportunities for ribbon-cutting ceremonies that will be covered by the media, keeping a politician's name and image before the public in a favorable light, thereby enhancing the politician's re-election prospects. But there are no ribbon-cutting ceremonies for filling in potholes or keeping a bridge or school in good repair, unless there is some obvious defect, both immediately visible and important to a large segment of the voting public. There is little or no political payoff for doing such things. Moreover, delayed maintenance is in most cases unlikely to cause any serious problem before the next election, even if it leads to disasters in the long run during some future administration. Such incentives and responses are not peculiar to the United States or to modern times. In the 18th century, Adam Smith noted how in France, some work of splendor and magnificence was more likely to be built by a proud minister of an ostentatious court than were a great number of little works, even when the latter have extreme utility. He said that in France, the great roads, the great communications which are likely to be the subjects of conversation at the court and in the capital are attended to, and all the rest neglected. Not only do politicians tend to think no further than stage one, the laws and policies they create tend to proceed as if other people do not think beyond stage one. Thus, a government agency set up to safeguard the pensions of workers in private companies has been used by airlines facing bankruptcy to transfer their pension obligations to the taxpayers. Why would these airlines and other companies have taken on pension obligations that they did not have the money to meet? Because they could avoid a strike by putting such benefits into a union contract that they signed, knowing that, if necessary, they could in later years shift those obligations to the government. They thought beyond stage one, even if those who supported this government program did not. To analyze the market does not preclude the existence of non-market activities or prejudge their effectiveness, any more than the study of automotive engineering precludes the existence or prejudges the effectiveness of alternative modes of transportation. What economic analysis of markets does is utilize a body of knowledge, analysis, and experience that has accumulated and developed over a period of centuries to systematically examine the consequences of various economic actions and policies. The fact that these consequences can determine the poverty or prosperity of millions of citizens in a given country, and billions of people worldwide, is what makes it important to understand economics. The real question is not which policy or system would work best ideally, but which has in fact produced better results with far from ideal human beings. Even with the more modest task of evaluating different policies within a given system, the real question is not which policy sounds more plausible or which would work best if people behaved ideally, but which policy in fact turns out to produce better results with actual people behaving as they actually do. This latter question will be addressed in different contexts in the chapters that follow. Chapter 2. Free and Unfree Labor. A student asked his history professor, "Where did slavery come from?" "You're asking the wrong question."